And then the final challenge, and in some ways kind of like the biggest one, was, all right, we have this workflow, we kind of have each of the steps to generate our package and to publish it, but how do we automate this? How do we make it run so that, I don't have to touch it? I can just say run on the first of every month or whatever, or every other Friday or something like that. And it turns out that the solution to kind of all of those was GitHub Actions, which was kind of a fun discovery. I had tried implementing this whole workflow a couple of different ways. I played around with Docker. I played around with like Jupyter notebooks in a proprietary virtual environment. And they kind of each fell short at some point along the way here. But GitHub Actions ended up being able to kind of provide actually a really nice solution to all of the challenges that we had. So just a quick overview of GitHub Actions. So we're using GitHub Actions specifically for the R language, although it supports many. But it's a relatively new service that's provided by GitHub now that allows you to like run and schedule jobs in a virtual environment. And it supports all of the operating systems. It has pretty generous resource allocation compared to similar services. I think it's something like it allows you to be running 20 concurrent jobs that take up to like 6 hours each. There's really minimal setup outside of just kind of the usual provisioning of a GitHub repo and GitHub account, which probably most of us are familiar with. It's free to use for open source academic and educational repositories, which is huge. That's a really big one. Free to use is, yeah, definitely a good quality there. And there's a lot of support, even for the R language, for some common actions like setting up R in this virtual environment where you're going to be running these scripts, or installing package dependencies, things like that. There's a whole kind of list. Actually, I'll take a quick look here. But there's a whole list of example actions that are already kind of like pre-built and verified by the GitHub Actions team. I guess there's sort of an R contingency of the GitHub Actions team that have built up all of these actions. And you can kind of just pull them into your script as needed, or your workflow as needed. There's also really good logging and sort of debugging tools, as I found out. And so some of the common uses for GitHub Actions, I think probably the most common is going to be CI, continuous integration, or testing. I think one of the more common tools used for that right now is Travis CI. So GitHub Actions essentially can provide a replacement to something like that, where somebody on the team has merged a pull request. We want to run the full suite of tests to make sure nothing's broken. All of that kind of stuff can be accomplished in GitHub Actions. There's also other cool things you can do, obviously, like what I implemented, or our markdown workflows for rendering, Shiny app deployment, things like that. And again, there's kind of a whole list of interesting examples here, and example workflows to build off of. So for my use case, the first step was to actually set up our GitHub repository to communicate with the GitHub Actions service. There were a couple of steps involved, but the main one actually maybe is number 2 here. I probably should have put this one first, but essentially you need to create a .yaml file under this folder structure, .github/workflows. And once you have that YAML file there, GitHub automatically kind of includes your repository in its screening of GitHub Actions services, which is really cool. That YAML file that you create there is also going to be where sort of the bulk of your steps of the workflow go. And we'll get to that in a minute. Another step that I took, and actually I have just recently kind of been testing as to whether or not this is necessary, but is to, with your R project, actually create a package out of it. There's a nice library called Use This that makes it really straightforward to do this. Basically, it turns your R project into an R package, essentially. And what this allows is the creation of a description file, which some of those pre-built actions that I was just showing you can reference later on. And it just makes some of the configuration easier. Like I said, it might not be 100% necessary. I'm still kind of testing that out. But and then third, for your GitHub repository is you need to set up an environment, which is something that you can do pretty easily, in the GitHub UI. But that environment is will encompass the run of your workflow and can hold, the authentication secrets or whatever else you need there. So I'm going to step through the YAML file that I built. But essentially, it's sort of just dictating each step that we need to take in order to run our scripts. I have it open somewhere. Okay. All right. So the first line here is dictating the trigger for our GitHub action, for our action essentially. And right now you can see this is commented out, but basically on a schedule is when I want this to run. This is commented out because I've been doing some testing. So on workflow dispatch is a really kind of helpful thing that you can set that allows you to go in and actually just manually trigger. So like say I've made a change down here, I want to test that change. On workflow dispatch allows me to just go manually trigger it, see what happens. But the regular state of this file will be using the schedule here, which uses cron scheduling to kind of assign a runtime for this. And GitHub Actions, the GitHub Actions service will be able to kind of read this and understand, hey, this is when we want this to run, and it will run it for you. So it just uses the cron syntax, which essentially is like, it's like minute, hour, day of the month or something. And then essentially what this is saying is we would want this to run on the 1st of every month at midnight. So which is just kind of the cadence that we decided on at the Scoose team. Like I said, if we wanted to make it run every week or something, we could change that. It's all configurable here. So that's the first step there. The second chunk here is actually defining the job that we want to run. And so we've built this job called generate data. We're referencing the environment that I mentioned we had to build inside of our GitHub repository. Mine is called Habs Publish. And then we're setting up kind of the configuration of what operating system do we want this to run on, what dependencies does it need, and all of that. So this whole chunk, basically from here down, is actually stepping through what we need to accomplish. So the first one, this is a pre-built action from GitHub Actions. It's actually just checking out our repository. So let's see. So this is the repository that I've set up. So step one of this is actually to check out that repository. Then we're installing OS dependencies. We're using a pre-built action to install R and get R all set up in kind of this virtual environment. And then we're installing any R dependencies that we need. So all of the packages that our script is dependent on. We can see, EDI utils here. That's one of them that we need. And then we're installing all the dependencies. So pretty much this whole chunk up to here is just kind of setting up the virtual environment, which is, it's running on Linux, and it's just essentially spinning up R so that we can run our scripts. Once that's all done, we can actually execute the R scripts that we wrote. So this step here, generate our Darwin core archive data package. This is kind of that first chunk that I mentioned, where, for building the data package. And it's just running this script. So source on that script file, it's just executing that script. And if you recall, the results of that script are files being written out to a specific folder. Then kind of comes the point here where we can stage the generated files for publishing. So that's not something that we accomplished in either of the R scripts, but it's something that GitHub Actions allows us to do. So after we've generated these updated files, we've written them out into our repository, which we essentially have checked out. We can then commit those files back into the repository. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to kind of keep in a singular place the most up-to-date version of these files, so that during the publishing step, it can always look back to the same place and see and always get the most updated version. And so this is actually making a commit into your repository. So it's taking all the files that we changed, updating them, and then committing them in. And I've been making a lot of commits here, but we can see here, here's an example of that commit happening. So updated auto-generated dataset files. The commit was made by Actions user. So you can see that's all happening, through the execution of this GitHub action. Once we've committed the files, then we can move on to our publishing step, where we are ingesting our authentication secrets, and then running our publishing step, which can then, use these secrets that we've passed in and execute the publishing. And then after that, we're just kind of closing out the session, just sort of printing some session info, and that's the entirety of it. So unfortunately, I decided this morning that I wanted to try to make some optimizations to this YAML file, and I think I broke some things. Okay, this one worked, so that's good. But you can see, so this is just a tab under the GitHub repository. So this is my repository. There's an Actions tab here. And I can find the workflow that I've created with that YAML file. And like I mentioned, right now, that workflow is set to run on a manual trigger, and we can see that here. If I wanted to, I could run this workflow. So that said, this was one I guess I was testing half an hour ago, and I can see each step sort of that I've established in that YAML file. So here's kind of the setup, installing the environment. And then here's where I run that first script, and it's got, gives me all the output for that. Here's where this is where I commit the generated files, and then here's where I publish to EDI. And I can, I already know that it didn't fail, which is good, but I can always look back here if something went wrong, maybe in the publishing step. I can come back here and check, all right, what were the errors? Maybe what went wrong here. And yeah, and so that's kind of the whole thing.